On April 10th, 2026, 4 astronauts splashed down in the Pacific Ocean after 10 days in space. They had flown to the moon and back. They had set the distance record for the farthest any human has ever traveled from Earth. And when they climbed out of the capsule, they could walk, but just barely. Their cardiovascular systems had deconditioned. Their muscles had begun to atrophy. Their blood volume had dropped. 1 in 4 astronauts returning from the International Space Station cannot stand for 10 continuous minutes within hours of landing. The Artemis II crew managed to walk to the medical bay under their own power, but they had been in zero gravity for 10 days. 10 days. A round trip to Mars takes roughly 3 years. That number is the one that nobody in a position of authority wants to sit with long enough to follow where it leads. 3 years. Approximately 7 months of transit to Mars, a surface stay of weeks to months, depending on the mission architecture. Then 7 months back. The entire journey spent either in zero gravity or in the 1/3 gravity of the Martian surface, which is better than nothing, but nowhere close to the gravitational load the human body was built to sustain. Every system in the body that degraded on Artemis II over 10 days will degrade further, for longer, with compounding effects that have never been observed in a human being, because no human being has ever been exposed to these conditions for this duration. We are designing a mission to a planet we have never reached, using data from a space station in low Earth orbit, extrapolated from timelines that are an order of magnitude shorter than the actual journey. The extrapolation looks devastating. Start with the bones. The Artemis II crew lost bone density at a rate of approximately 1 to 2% per month in weight-bearing bones. On a 7-month transit to Mars, that translates to roughly 7 to 14% of total bone density gone before the crew even arrives. The calcium does not disappear. It enters the bloodstream and migrates to the kidneys, raising the risk of kidney stones in an environment where the nearest hospital is 140 million miles away. On the Martian surface, partial gravity slows the loss, but does not stop it. The return transit adds another 7 months of degradation. By the time the crew lands back on Earth, they may have lost 20% or more of their bone mass. Recovery from that level of loss takes years, if it happens at all. Some International Space Station astronauts have reported bone density that never fully returned to pre-flight levels, and their missions were 6 months, not 3 years. The muscles are worse in some ways because they affect operational capability at the destination. On Earth, even standing requires constant engagement of the legs, back, and core against gravity. In zero gravity, those muscles have almost nothing to do, and they atrophy. On the ISS, astronauts exercise 2 hours per day on specialized equipment, weighing over 4,000 pounds to slow the process. It works partially. It does not prevent the loss entirely. By the time a Mars crew arrives at the planet after 7 months of zero gravity, their lower body musculature will be significantly weakened. They will then need to perform surface operations in spacesuits that weigh roughly 130 pounds under Earth gravity, which translates to about 50 pounds on Mars. Walking, climbing, bending, carrying equipment, entering and exiting vehicles, all of it with muscles that have been idle for 7 months. Apollo astronauts, who spent far less time in zero gravity, reported difficulty with simple movements on the lunar surface. A Mars crew will face the same challenges magnified by a factor of 10 in duration. Then there is radiation, and this is the one that may be the actual wall. On Earth, the average person receives about 2.4 millisieverts of radiation per year from natural background sources. On the International Space Station, astronauts receive roughly half a millisievert per day while sheltered inside Earth's magnetosphere. In deep space, outside Earth's magnetic field, the exposure rate triples. The dominant source is galactic cosmic rays, high-energy protons, and heavy ions that originate from supernovae and other violent events across the galaxy. These particles pass through spacecraft walls, through equipment, through human tissue. They cannot be fully shielded with any material that a spacecraft can practically carry. NASA's current career radiation limit for astronauts is 600 millisieverts. A round trip to Mars near solar minimum, when galactic cosmic ray exposure is highest, would deliver an estimated dose that exceeds that limit by roughly 3 times. NASA's own models predict that the combined risk of exposure-induced death from cancer and circulatory disease on a 940-day Mars mission could exceed 5%, with upper confidence bounds approaching 10%. That means between 1 in 20 and 1 in 10 crew members may die from radiation-induced disease as a direct result of the mission. These are not theoretical risks. They are modeled using the same frameworks NASA uses to certify every human spaceflight mission. And by those models, a Mars mission is currently uncertifiable. The agency cannot send a crew on a mission that it knows will exceed its own safety standards, which means either the standards change or the mission does not fly. And shielding doesn't solve the problem the way most people assume. Adding material to the spacecraft walls does reduce the dose from solar particle events, the occasional bursts of protons from solar flares. But for galactic cosmic rays, the high-energy heavy ions that do the most biological damage, additional aluminum shielding actually makes the problem worse. When these particles hit the shielding material, they fragment into secondary particles, including neutrons, that can be more biologically damaging than the original cosmic rays. On the Martian surface, the planet's thin atmosphere provides some protection, roughly equivalent to 20 grams per square centimeter of shielding, but it is not enough. There is no material solution that currently exists that can reduce deep space radiation exposure to acceptable levels without making the spacecraft so heavy that it cannot be launched. The cardiovascular system faces a different kind of risk. In zero gravity, the heart remodels. It becomes slightly more spherical. Blood volume drops. The system deconditions because it no longer has to pump against gravity. After 10 days, the Artemis II crew needed compression garments to prevent blood from pooling in their legs during re-entry. After 7 months in zero gravity, the deconditioning will be profound. And when the crew arrives at Mars, they will experience a gravitational transition from 0 to 0.38 times Earth gravity, which sounds gentle, but their cardiovascular systems may struggle to handle it. There is limited data on how the human heart performs after months of zero gravity in a partial gravity field, because no human has ever experienced it. The Mars 500 simulation, a 520-day isolation study conducted in Moscow between 2010 and 2011, replicated the confinement and timeline of a Mars mission. But it could not replicate the zero gravity, the radiation, or the actual physiological stresses. It tested the mind. It could not test the body. What Mars 500 did reveal was troubling enough. 6 men were confined in a 550 cubic meter chamber for 520 days. The study found substantial differences in how individual crew members responded to prolonged isolation. Some maintained stable mood and performance throughout. Others experienced significant behavioral distress, disrupted sleep patterns, reduced cognitive performance, and emotional numbness. The researchers observed a pattern consistent with what psychologists call the third quarter phenomenon, a period roughly 3/4 through a mission when morale typically reaches its lowest point. On a Mars mission, the third quarter would fall during the surface stay or early return transit, precisely the period when the crew needs to be at peak performance. Communication delays make everything worse. At its closest, Mars is about 3 light minutes from Earth. At its farthest, about 24 light minutes. A distress call from the Martian surface would take up to 24 minutes to reach Earth, and the response would take another 24 minutes to arrive. That is a 48-minute round trip for a single exchange. In an emergency, there is no real-time guidance from Houston. The crew is alone with whatever training they carry and whatever tools they have on hand. If an astronaut is injured on the surface, the crew treats them. If equipment fails, the crew fixes it. If a critical system breaks and they cannot repair it, there is no resupply mission. There is no abort. The next launch window back to Earth opens only every 26 months. If something goes catastrophically wrong in the 3rd month of a surface stay, the crew waits for over 2 years. The eyes. Vision changes from spaceflight-associated neuroocular syndrome caused by fluid shifts and increased intracranial pressure affect nearly half of astronauts on long-duration missions. Some experience vision changes that persist for years after return. On a 3-year Mars mission, the cumulative effect of sustained intracranial pressure changes on the optic nerve and retinal structures is unknown, because no one has been exposed to it for that long. An astronaut whose vision degrades during transit may arrive at Mars unable to perform precision tasks. That is not a theoretical concern. It is a documented physiological response that worsens with duration of exposure. The immune system adds another dimension that rarely enters the public conversation about Mars. In microgravity, the immune system suppresses. White blood cell counts drop. The body's ability to fight infection weakens at the same time that the confined, recycled air environment of a spacecraft becomes an ideal breeding ground for bacteria and fungi. Dormant viruses that the crew already carries, like Epstein-Barr and herpes simplex, can reactivate during spaceflight because the immune system no longer keeps them in check. On the International Space Station, this is manageable because crew rotations are short, and resupply missions bring fresh medication. On a Mars transit, there is no resupply. The onboard pharmacy is finite. If a crew member develops a serious infection 9 months into the journey, the antibiotics they need may have degraded in the radiation environment, or they may simply not have brought the right ones. A medical emergency that would be routine in a hospital on Earth becomes potentially fatal in a spacecraft 80 million miles from the nearest doctor. Every one of these problems is being studied. NASA's Human Research Program is investigating pharmacological countermeasures for radiation. Exercise protocols are being refined. The Chapia habitat at Johnson Space Center is running year-long Mars surface simulations. SpaceX and NASA are exploring artificial gravity concepts. None of these countermeasures have been validated in the actual deep space environment for the actual duration of a 3-year mission. They are being tested on Earth in low Earth orbit and in simulations that cannot replicate the combined effect of zero gravity, radiation, isolation, communication delay, and duration, all acting on the same crew at the same time. The interaction effects are unknown. The compounding effects are unknown. The actual risk to a real crew on a real 3-year mission is, in the most honest scientific sense, unmeasurable with current data. Artemis 2 just showed us what 10 days does. The ISS has shown us what 6 months does. Nobody has shown us what 3 years does, because nobody has survived 3 years in deep space. That is the wall. Not propulsion, not funding, not political will. The wall is the human body. It was not built for this. It was built for a planet with a magnetic field, an atmosphere, and a gravitational pull of 9.8 meters per second squared, and every hour it spends away from those conditions, it begins to come apart. Mars is 140 million miles away. Getting there is an engineering problem. Surviving the trip is a biological one, and right now, the biology is losing. If you want to keep exploring what the universe is really doing, subscribe and I'll see you in the next one.